All right, so we are 2 minutes before the start of, like I would like to say, the highlight panel of the 2020 Texas Composting and Recycling Summit. Totally said that backwards, sorry. I did tell everyone I was narcoleptic on our last session, but so maybe I'm dyslexic too. But anyways, Texas Recycling and Compost Summit 2020, incredible session about to start here, incredible panelists. Get your coffee, get your cat, your dog, whatever you're going to sit and listen to this incredible session with. And I was just helping my 7th grader over my phone try to solve pre-algebra for in the minutes that we had before this. So that was fun. But it looks like we got the variables solved. So good.
Amazing.
it's the sign of the times, right? It's like, hey, I got this question. So it's
yes.
2020. That's all I'm just summed up. 2020.
Hello.
Basically.
My neighbor's helping me out with my 2.5-year-old that I was like, this is a little longer than we typically do. So let's just.
Yes. Yeah, look at that. We're getting good. So 53 in here so far, and it'll just keep on growing. We have 1 minute before we'll kick this thing off. But yes, so attendees, please turn on your cameras. The panelists can see your face. It does provide us with that more in-person experience. Although you are only able to see one speaker when they speak, we can see you. And so again, that helps us read the emotions that you're feeling or the responses to what we're saying and kind of get that action with our attendees. So please, if you can, and if you're willing, turn on your cameras, keep muted. But other than that, we'd love to see your faces. And again, this is going to be a deep dive into a very pertinent topic that we are about to break down some walls, getting some heavy conversations here and some realities that it's time to face up to. So I am excited about this session. And again, promoting the crud out of this because this is what we need to talk about. So all things said, it is 11 o'clock. Let me go over the quick housekeeping stuff, and then we'll get right into this 90-minute session. Again, this is the only session today, actually of the whole 5 days, that we have afforded an hour and a half due to the fact that this is the top discussion point of 2020. This is what we should be focusing on. These are the issues in our environmental sector right now that no one or very few people have addressed over the long term. This is all very short term and very new in some sense, even though it's decades old. So I'm not going to steal the thunder from this, but we know that there are problems in our industry. We know that there are siting issues with where we put landfills and transfer stations. We know that we go to inequitable areas and socioeconomic areas that are underserved, and we prefer those to put our waste areas or our handling material areas. And we know that there are limitations to accesses of services. We know that people can't do the same thing even though they live in the same city based on either their race or their religion or their social class. We have a lot of problems. And so that is what this panel is. We are going to dive into those problems. We are going to dive into some of the solutions. We're going to talk about some realities that it is time to really open up to. So without further ado, our moderator today from City of Austin, ARR, I'm super appreciative of all of this. Skyra, I'm going to turn it over to you. You have the show. I do appreciate you putting this on, and I will give you the rest of this time and your panelists. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Really appreciate it. Good morning to all of you. Before we get started, we ask that you take a quiet moment to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as original stewards of the land before now known as Austin, Texas, and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. To recognize the land as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous peoples who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. Land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and we need to be mindful that we are participating in it by living on colonized land. We acknowledge with respect that the land we are on is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Tonkawa, the Apache, the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians, and all other tribes not explicitly stated. Additionally, we like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Alabama Coshada Tribe of Texas, the Kickapoo Tribe of Texas, Carrizo and Comacrudo, Tiguawa, Pueblo, Caddo, Comanche, Kiowa, Wichita, Chickasaw, and Waco nations, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become part of these lands and territories in Texas, here on Turtle Island. Not all indigenous people listed claim Texas as ancestral lands, and as many were forcibly relocated to Texas from their ancestral homelands. It is important to understand the long history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to acknowledge our place within that history. The state of Texas is a product of violence carried out by colonial powers of Anglo and Mexican groups. Multiple genocides were committed on the native peoples of Central Texas as natives were hunted, detained, converted, and colonized in successive waves. Many peoples were also assimilated, including most peoples labeled Kalahutecan and many Lipan Apache with no treaties or recognition. Climate change is inextricably linked to humanity's long history of inequality and the injustice perpetuated by legacies of colonialism and slavery based on the exploitation of people, land, and nature. Today, the ongoing displacement of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color on Austin's East Side is connected to legacies of extraction of labor, theft of land, transformation of landscapes, and loss of cultures. In pursuit of resources, country is destroyed many of the ecosystems, traditional human knowledge, and interactions necessary for preventing climate change. Therefore, we need to be intentional about how we build respect for the land and her indigenous peoples. For every panel or conversation that I host, I always start with a land acknowledgement. It is important that we recognize that we live on stolen lands and the peoples who were living here before us. So thank you all this morning for joining us for our panel. I'm really excited about the conversation that we are going to have this morning. Before we begin, I always like to begin with representation. So we believe in not about us without us, which came into popular use in the disability activism movement during the 1980s. So today our panelists will share their academic, professional, and lived experiences. And we also recognize that there are many identities and experiences that are not represented here. And this is not all of our stories. So while we honor the voices present, we continually seek to be intentional about ensuring that we appreciate the voices represented and that we are intentional about making sure that everyone is at the table for current and future conversations. My name is Skyra Rito. I am the Economic Development Services Coordinator for the City of Austin. I work in Austin Resource Recovery and the Economic Development Department. My job is specifically focused around business recruitment and retention for the circular economy industry. And also because I work in the sustainability, zero waste, and environmental sector, my job is also to ensure that we are doing our practices in an equitable way, that we recognize that the work that we do is privileged because of where we work and what has happened historically with communities of color in terms of environmental racism. I wanted to make sure that we had this topic and this conversation clearly because as a nation, this conversation is rising to the top as something important that we need to deal with as a country, but also because of where I work and where I live and the historical context of what's going on with, within the environmental and zero waste movement. And so I'm excited to bring to you a panel of experts who will talk more in depth about the zero waste movement, its privilege, racist practices, but also we'll talk about how we can all move forward in solidarity and being more anti-racist in the future. So my name is Skyra Rito again. I identify as a Black woman and my gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. And so I will kick it off to Tina Shelvin Bingham. She is the Executive Director of the Macomb-Vizay Neighborhood Community Development Corporation in Lafayette, Louisiana, to give us a brief introduction of herself and the work that she does in Lafayette. Tina?
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for welcoming me to Austin by way of Zoom. I'm here in Lafayette, Louisiana. As Skyra said, I'm the Executive Director for the Lafayette, for the Macomb-Vizay Neighborhood Coterie, but I also wear a dual hat as the Community Development Director for the Lafayette Habitat for Humanity here in the Lafayette affiliate in Lafayette, Louisiana. I work primarily in the intersection of health and housing, and we also work on community revitalization, which is the primary focus of how we beautify and rectify the wrongs that have been happening to our community. So I'm very excited to be a part of this panel to share with these lovely ladies some of the great things that, you know, the lived experience and some of the boots on the ground, that things that we've seen out in the community, but then also to reflect on some of the ways that, you know, we can all do a little bit better to help our communities improve and all improve the quality of life truly across the board. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Tina. And then we have Dr. Karen McGid with Hudson Tillotson.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks, Skyra, for putting this amazing panel together, and Star and Jordan for having us as well. As Skyra mentioned, I work for Houston Tillotson University here in Austin, Austin's only historically Black university. I'm the Director of Sustainability and STEM, and I lead our Center for Sustainability and Environmental Justice. I also am the current chair of the Austin Travis County Food Policy Board, and I serve on our Joint Sustainability Committee as well. And I've been taking part over the last year in our Austin, soon to be hopefully the passed, adopted by council, our climate equity plan, the revamp of our Austin Community Climate Plan. So coming today to talk hopefully some about that, but also the perspective from the food and policy and education perspectives. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen.
Oh, and Brooke, I use she, her pronouns. Sorry.
Thank you. Nina Means, she is the director of the Austin Community College Fashion Incubator. Nina.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Skyra. It's a pleasure to be here, and I second some of the comments that have come out about just the humbling acknowledgement of the land and where we are. You know, we have, I acknowledge, you know, I'm an African-American woman, I identify as Black. As many Black people in the United States, our heritage has been blended. And so I come from the East Coast, and so my grandmother is part of the Cherokee. And so it's a very, you know, blended heritage based on our history here in the States. So we are at the ACC Fashion Incubator. Our primary stand is integrating technology to help us support sustainability throughout the design process for emerging brands and businesses. We support workforce development in partnership with the City of Austin Economic Development Department, small business, global business expansion, and we've participated a lot in the recruitment of businesses that are coming into the area in our particular industry. We are, a part of our conversation is how are brands integrating the sustainability conversation and transparency throughout the value chain, and how are we helping them to go to market in a responsible way, and what does that look like as we're evolving here and becoming more aware of how the fashion industry has been well known and well documented as having, you know, proliferated a lot of these situations that we're having across the world in communities of color. And so we're looking forward to addressing some of that here. Some of them we won't have perfect answers for, but that we are still in the process of developing solutions and bringing us to a new age of the fashion industry. And we really believe technology is going to be at the forefront of that. So I'm looking forward to the talk today and sharing more about our background. So thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And last but definitely not least, we have Jane Patton. She is the director of No Waste Louisiana. Jane.
Hey, y'all. I am really pleased and honored to be joining this panel and this conversation from my home in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I third or fourth or fifth the gratitude for the land acknowledgement and the acknowledgement of the history of both violence and the real lived privilege that a lot of European descendant people are living in, most, you know, all of us living in the United States. I'm not sure how to phrase whether I identify as a white person or am identified as a white person. My pronouns are she, her. I identify that I have a lot of privilege in that and work to overcome it. And I'm hoping to bring some of that learning and thinking and reflecting, not to just to this conversation, but to my work generally, and acknowledge, and I'm grateful for the work of the United Homa Nation here in South Louisiana, both as an original indigenous group here, but also the continued work that the Homa Nation has brought both to the environmental work, but just to the land stewardship and the spirit of collaboration and cooperation that we are all in here together. As Skyra said, I am the director and co-founder of No Waste Louisiana, with chapters in both Lafayette, New Orleans, and hopefully Baton Rouge soon, which is where I'm from. I am also a senior campaigner with the Center for International Environmental Law. That's what I call my day job, but it's actually my all the time job. My specialty is plastics and thinking about the supply chain of plastics and how that affects everybody's whole life, not just waste, but actually also looking at the petrochemical development here in South Louisiana and across the United States, and the forces of money and environmental racism and generally racism that we are fighting, that we are up against in that fight. So very grateful to be part of this conversation and to be joining you guys today. And oh, sorry, just want to say one more thing. I'm also part of a group here across the Gulf states called the Gulf South for a Green New Deal, the policy platform that's actually looking at how do we holistically address the climate and environmental racism and fisheries and ocean and land crisis that we're under right now in the environmental space. And plastics and zero waste play a big role in that, but as do all of the work that is represented by this panel and so much more than that. And I am honored to also bring that experience and work into this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jane. So we're going to go ahead and get started. But before we do, I just want to let everyone know why we're here and what we're going to be talking about. So we know that sustainability and zero waste makes a lot of assumptions. It assumes you have the ability to buy bulk, you have access to fresh fruit and produce. It assumes you're economically stable enough to make upfront investments in reusable bags and glass containers and more expensive but sustainable clothing, and you can afford convenience, right? And that's a very simplified version of our zero waste industry, and not even talking about the environmental racism and environmental impacts of Black and Indigenous communities of color. So this morning we will discuss how environmental racism and the recycling and reuse movement are inextricably linked, and the historical and modern day facts and information related to reuse and recycling. So this panel specifically will give insight and suggestions on ways that those of us with privilege can act and fight in solidarity with activists already doing the work, and how we can examine and advance recycling and reuse goals that don't further perpetuate the racial and class divide. And so I'm gonna start with a question. So regarding environmental racism, what are we missing in the conversation about recycling and reuse movement, whether from a policy, materials, or equity standpoint in your specific industry or profession, and how both currently and historically has it perpetuated racial and class divides? And I think I'm gonna kick it to Karen to kick us off.
Thanks, Skyra. Yeah, so I come at this from a few different perspectives, as I mentioned, like from the education perspective and then from the food and the food policy perspective. And I mean, essentially we have a system that's not set up to support choice, to reduce our impact on the climate, on planet, health, supporting health. And when it comes to, food waste, we have a food waste problem in an inequitable food system. So we can work on solutions that waste less food, but it won't solve all the problems of the components of the food system upstream from that. If I think about education, and so one other piece of this is that the intersections as well, how all of these are going to be connected. And fundamentally I feel like what it's going to come down to is that, especially when it comes to food insecurity, that poverty is the problem. And you can have solving all those pieces, like you can come solutions of that, and then you're still going to have problems. When I pivot to the education piece of it, I think about what gets studied and by who are the scientists and the academics, and this quote that it's not attributed to anyone. I know if you look at it online, there's some pieces of it that get attributed to various people, but we see the world not as it is, but as we are. And that's educationally when it comes down to who's been asking the questions and who's been looking into and doing the research. That's a fundamental issue, and there's gaps, right? If you don't look at what's not been asked and who's been doing the research and what they've not been asking, you're gonna miss things. So there's so much to unpack, and this panel is going to get into all of it. I'm really excited for all of that. So I want to say policy has gotten us into this mess. I think policy has a role. I think education has a role. I think research, but looking at how can you support who does research and who can be considered an expert, and where can knowledge be generated and come from and supported. Those are all going to be really critical pieces.
Thank you for sharing that, Karen. Nina, do you have anything to add in terms of like what's missing in the conversation, particularly when we're talking about upcycling in the fashion industry? Like, what are we not talking about? I know Karen mentioned like a lot of things we don't think about is who's collecting the data, not just who's collecting it. What questions are they asking, and how are they interpreting and analyzing it, and then putting that information back out into policymakers? And that all matters, right? But when we're talking about fashion and upcycling and those types of things, what's missing from that conversation?
So much is missing. Well, you know, I love what Karen brought out regarding education and infrastructure, because she's right. It's like we have to frame the situation through the correct lens. And I believe that in terms of upcycling and, you know, where fashion fits in with this, you know, there's a lot of consumer variables of behavior. Like, why do we do what we do? Why are people engaging the way that they do? And what are our psychological connections to upcycling? And how much time does it actually take for us to upcycle? And is that a necessity, or is it something that's a nice to have, or, you know, or what's the impression in our local community whenever it's apparent that you've been upcycling? You know, a lot of what has driven the fashion industry to where we've been is, you know, volume and inventory, the request and demand for newness. We constantly want to see something new. We constantly want to re-evolve. And I believe that even now, as we're talking about what's happening with the pandemic, a lot of people are kind of in this, you know, cocoon-like state. It's kind of like everyone's in their sweats and running around in their, you know, activewear, and we're like really happy about it. You know, we're loving this. However, you know, where a lot of people are still, you know, expecting is that there's going to be a request to now, once the doors are flung open, I want to reimagine myself. I want to reinvent myself. And so what's going to be there to help me to do that? And this is driven by consumer behavior. This is not, so, you know, regardless of, you know, where you come from, you know, we can say we want to upcycle, we want to create, but if the demand and the culture is for something different, a capitalistic industry, just like all of our industries are going to sell into that demand. So I think that that's a larger conversation that has to happen in terms of that shift in social behavior, about what it is that we're trying to do. And it's underscored by environmental racism.
How is it underscored by environmental racism? Tell us a little bit more about that.
I would love to tell you more about that. So, you know, you know, in terms of what's available in the market for various communities, people are struggling with, you know, what they're putting on their families and what they're putting on themselves and what they're buying into in terms of the way that products are made. If you talk to a family and say, you know, I really appreciate our pre-meeting that we had, and Tina was like, they're not running to Target, they're running some, you know, they're running to their friend's house to get in, you know, borrow something from, you know, a cousin, or they're, you know, maybe it's Goodwill, or maybe it's another place where the clothing is less expensive. But they're buying into, when you have a moment to purchase something, you're probably going to be buying into fast fashion because you don't have the resources to invest into more. And it's contributing to someone else's experience overseas where that was made perhaps without, you know, appropriate labor restrictions, without appropriate attention to the way that the waste is being dumped into their water supply, without concern about what kinds of fumes they're having to inhale the entire time they're doing their work. There's so many different components that, because of a lack of resources, it's contributing to a lack of resources in other places. And so it becomes this huge cycle that's so much larger than just, I'd like to be more environmentally conscious. It's so much bigger than that. And we really see, and what I love about this panel that you pulled together, Skyra, is that you pulled together so many different components that seemingly are separate, and they are not. They are inextricably linked, and our ability to provide healthy, safe places for people to live, appropriate food for people to feed their families at an affordable rate, clothing that's not polluting their water to drink. You know, all of these things are all, and then it's wrapped globally. It's a huge chain. And with fashion, you know, we can't get away from that. We've impacted, I've got some of that for a later comment, but you know, we've impacted manufacturing across the globe because of what we insist on price-wise in the States.
So I'm glad that both you and Karen are sharing about like the underlying conversations that are missing, like when we're talking about who's collecting data, what type of data are we sharing, who's analyzing, and then who has like the privilege, right, to really think about what they're buying and how they're spending their money. And I want to open it up to Jane and Tina to talk a little bit more about the environmental things, because I know, Tina, you work directly in a neighborhood with the people that are Black, who may have experienced things that are being like made by other decision makers that are impacting those communities. So maybe if you want to speak a little bit more to like what is missing on those conversations when we're talking about like on the ground real impacts to communities, like what is missing when we're talking about recycling and reuse?
Man, I think what Karen and Nina both said, like access to the education, access to the infrastructure, is what's missing. It's a racial, it's an environmental racism, but it's laced in inequities. We're missing the equity in where, like Karen said, or who's making the decisions and who's showing, putting up that pie chart, right? That tells you that, you know, you're in a food desert, that your family has less access to toxins because they're located downwind of some plant somewhere, you know? And how do you get access to those things? Like a lot of people in BIPOC communities, not only African American communities, lack access to the information as far as where all those facilities are located. How do we recycle? You know, like that's one of the biggest things. You hear the council meeting every year, every week here in Lafayette, where they talk about the issues of things that are going in the recycling bins and how they have to throw whole trucks away or send them away because they can't dump them in the recycling facilities because it takes too much time to process all of those things. But an education in the community could help with some of those things. But then also looking at the way our communities look at fashion. And this the consumerism that we're just kind of stuck in, that whole cycle of the newness and wanting the new thing, and how just as Americans in our communities, in our society, how we affect the country. Nestle is one of the biggest culprits in Africa, in communities that don't have water. You know, they pump water out of their communities and send it to our communities for us to drink. And we just keep on drinking it, y'all. And we have perfectly good water here in the US. So there's a lot to be worked on. There's a lot to be worked on within our communities. There's a lot that the community needs access to access to the politicians, access to the companies who have access to the resources, or access to, you know, our white allies who are, you know, here in the fight with us. And we just need a little extra helping hand to get us to the next stage, or, you know, an advocate to help us get to the next place, to the next policy advocate. So there's a lot of ways that, you know, we can plug in, but there's a lot missing. But for mostly within BIPOC communities, it's equity, I think, and access to the education and infrastructure to really be able to improve our community and educate everyone around us.
Thank you, Tina. Jane, before I move to the next question, did you have anything you wanted to add to the conversation about what's missing, particularly from a larger lens? I know you started No Waste Louisiana, but you also work in environmental law and plastics. And so what do you think is really missing from a 30,000 foot view? What conversations are we not having?
I think there are a lot of conversations that we are having in different kinds of silos, and sometimes those conversations are actually not being shared, especially like locality here to locality there. I'm really hearing Tina say that, you know, there are communities in Africa, in Southeast Asia, on other continents that are also victims of, and I don't mean to say victims, that are also harmed by environmental racism, that are harmed by white corporatist extraction. And actually we're having some conversations to connect communities, but there could always be more of that. And I think that what's missing is figuring out, you know, how does allyship actually support the continuance of those conversations, and also moving that conversation beyond allyship. And I see a little bit of this happening, but honestly not a lot. You know, we're all being morally eroded by this system. We are all being harmed. Our liberation collectively is wrapped up in getting out from underneath the weight and the harm that is exacerbated by corporations. And of course, the individual people who head and make decisions for those corporations. And I think it's important that we rehumanize ourselves, that we rehumanize our connections, and that we connections to each other and connections to the land, and our obligations to each other living in community together. And I think it's important that that conversation be constantly part, and that I think is something that is missing, is that thinking about how our liberation from this is wrapped up together, so that it is actually us working as a community to bring about a holistic solution here and to overcome the history of violence and extraction here in every locality around the world, is something I would love to see and make more present in the conversations that we are having here.
It's funny, so you talk about our liberation, and it reminds me of a quote by Lila Watson. It says, if you have come here to help me, then you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think that that's important as we're continuing to have this conversation, is understanding that when we work to dismantle the systems that have caused all of these inequities and environmental racism, everyone has an opportunity to be more free. It liberates everyone along the spectrum. And so moving into, like, segueing into that, Jane, like, how do you feel that environmental racism and disinvestment in BIPOC communities, mostly in urban areas, have led to those communities being susceptible to the placement of toxic waste facilities, sewage and treatment facilities within their neighborhoods?
Oh, there's so much. I mean, we could spend an entire hour and more talking about that particular question. And I think that that's actually a really core of some of the work that we do. But I'll talk really rooted in Louisiana in answer to that question. Last year, so a bunch of folks in the community got together, including Indigenous people and Black people and Hispanic and Latinx and white people and people of all colors and well, not all, but a large swath of representation, to have a conversation about how extraction has taken root in Louisiana, what has been the history of Indigenous forced migration, and the history of colonization and enslavement of peoples, and the history of the evolution from that into industrial plants and edifices that continue to extract. And seeing how much the roots of enslavement and colonialism are actually the roots of literally where plants are built in South Louisiana, and how they are built, how the land has been sold by plantation owning families to plant owning corporations. Literally, some of those facilities retain the names of the plantations, are actually now the names of the plants. I mean, the footprint, they're not trying to hide it. Like, Exxon is saying in their press releases about this new facility they're opening that it's built on the Buena Vista plantation. I mean, they know, they say it in the press release. And the fact that we are not reckoning with what that means and the harm that is being perpetuated, sorry, that is my child, the harm that is being perpetuated by communities who continue to live near lands where their ancestors were forced to work, and in many cases are buried anonymously, and fighting for access even to that history and to those families is something that is an ongoing present part of the resistance to these chemical plants these days. So when you ask me, like, why, how did they end up there, it is enshrined racism and the false ideation of white supremacy. And I say false because every time I say that phrase, I feel like I'm reinforcing it. So I just want to be like, it's a lie every time I say that, and to reinforce that. And I think, you know, it's built into the economic decisions that are made by the state of Louisiana. It's built into how they recruit plants to come here. It's built into how they draw the maps. I mean, this is the depth with which the plants are built in. And to segue and close the comment, that the way that we process then the waste that those plants make, right? We think about plants being oil and gas, but actually a lot of the plants in South Louisiana and South Texas now are plastic plants, which means they're plants that make waste, which means the waste is making people sick when it's being made, and it's making, frankly, Black people sick when it's being processed as waste. And the siting of the waste incinerators, I think it was 30 years ago, research found that regardless of income, so, you know, normally we have this conversation about the intersection of class and race, which is also a larger conversation, but regardless of income, incinerators tend to be placed in predominantly Black communities and predominantly Hispanic and Latinx communities across the United States, not just in the South, regardless of income. That is a major problem. The fact that we are considering entire populations of people to carry the burden of being downwind from waste processing facilities is something we have got to intentionally unpack. And that intentional unpacking means that we have to reduce our waste at the upfront, and it means that we as white people have to be openly willing to carry a different amount of the burden. And that is something that we've got to reckon with. And I don't know that, you know, as we talk about zero waste, and I see a lot of the faces of the zero waste movement now being white, like that doesn't feel like it's actually a reckoning, like creating equity within the system, because then the white people get to be zero waste, but like what's happening with everybody else? And as someone who tries to live zero waste, you can never actually be zero waste in this system. And so then who is carrying the burden of that waste? And that's a conversation that we're really only just beginning to have. And I hope to see that much more frequently.
And I'm so glad you mentioned, because isn't there a section in Louisiana called like Cancer Row or something?
Mm-hmm. Cancer Alley.
Cancer Alley. And it's named, and we're doing nothing, right, to address it. And Tina, I'm glad you unmuted, because I was gonna come to you. Like, as Jane was talking about communities who are intentionally negatively impacted by these toxic waste facilities and where they're placed, can you talk to us a little bit more about like how these land use policies are detrimental to Black and Brown communities?
Oh my goodness. So, you know, it goes back to a little bit of the first question where, you know, who's actually like at the table, right? Like who's making the decisions when it comes time to the policy, and how different plantations are able to develop their land into plants, right? We're just changing the system of slavery into another system of slavery. Only it's a paid position this time. You know, you're still making a whole bunch of money for somebody, just not for yourself. So the planning and the who has the seat at the table, who are our leaders, who are the people who are in these offices of planning, who are in the offices of development, who are, you know, guiding these decisions as far as how our communities are developed and where these things can happen. Usually when you find African-American communities, you find that if, in particular, speaking locally, in Lafayette, we, our intersection, our community has an interstate that's going to be proposed to run alongside of it that is zoned heavily commercial. And then we also have 2 corridors within our commercial. And it's not a big neighborhood, y'all. Like when you think about how big Lafayette is, okay, it's probably the smallest parish in Lafayette, in Louisiana, I think. But our city is not very big, but we have a large commercial area and a heavy residential area. Why? We're African Americans, and where it was a big warehouse district there at the time, and no one has done any efforts towards revitalizing those things and making any efforts to advocate as far as how we change those things. Now we have as a community on how we change the way our land is coded and how we get things developed within our community. We're working towards getting those things rezoned, but not many communities across the community have access the way we have been able to advocate on behalf of our community. So it's very important that the communities locally and on the national level have access to the people who are making the decisions, and also that they're educated on what these things actually mean in their community. What does it mean when, you know, you're zoned heavy commercial, and what's allowed in those spaces, you know? And those things are happening now. But, you know, to speak to Jane, a lot of the things that's been happening across the countries, like when she said that, you know, the plantations have become, you know, the plants, it's like the North and the South merged, right? People always say that, you know, racism, people in the North couldn't be racist, you know. We hated slavery, but it was different when we all started migrating to Chicago, and we started working in the plants, and people felt that their jobs were threatened. So the conversation shifts, and I feel like the plantation mentality merged with the manufacturing, and it just went global. You know, so how do we fix it? I don't know. It just makes sure the communities have better access to the people who are making the decisions on behalf of them, and that they're educated as far as what these things actually mean and how they make an impact in your community. In our community, we had a elementary school that was built prior on plantation land, farmable plantation land, and then 5 years after the school was built, they built a waste processing facility. So there's more sewage just being pumped right next to the classrooms. And then ironically, I went there that year that they decided to really like start rallying to shut it down. The school eventually shut down. We lost the school, but the waste facility was forced to do something better. So they got cleaner, I guess, but it's still there and still located within our community, but the community still lost an asset. We lost that neighborhood school for our kids.
So when you're talking a lot about like neighborhoods and communities having access to decision makers, one of the reasons why it's important for us to recognize advocacy is because now that you do this work full time, you can be a full-time advocate for the community when we're talking about zoning and land use policies and where things are located. But a lot of communities in our country do not have the privilege of having someone full-time that is able to do that type of work, right?
Absolutely,
So
yes.
Thank you for that. Tina, Karen, did you want to add anything? I saw you unmuted yourself. So.
Yeah, so there were so many things that pinged, and I just, like, for me, what it's also come back down to is also like, so this conversation is ongoing, right? It's from the first environmental justice protests and really the spark of the movement, which was only in the late 70s, early 80s, right? The first Warren County, North Carolina, cleanup of PCB dumping. So PCBs sprayed on the soil. And then it was really the fight about where that cleaned up dirt was going to be placed. And it was a predominantly black county in North Carolina. And the protests then that were fighting against that landfill. I mean, this was like, now we're talking like early to mid 80s. Like, this is not a long time ago. And again, Jane mentioned some of these studies, like it's over and over again that the studies are still pointing out that the siting is in predominantly, race is the single strongest, correlation factor. The geographic distribution is highly correlated with race. One step beyond that is in Texas, the criteria that are then used to determine how a site, once it's been identified as polluting, how much it will be cleaned up is weaker than almost any other state, especially in the South. So, and that's because Texas, and this is TCEQ, tolerates a higher cancer rate, essentially. Instead of 1 in a million, it's 1 in 100,000. And so first off, there's a fight about getting a site labeled as a site that needs to be cleaned up, whether this is a super fund and, engaging with the federal level of policy, but also, yeah, once it's been labeled as a cleanup site, to what stage does it get cleaned up? And in Texas, at least, we know that is a much lower standard. So it's just like every level of this, it comes back to this conversation, right? This is the systemic racism in this and how it has really been encoded into this system. So that's what I wanted to add.
And it also speaks to, as we're talking about this, I mean, some of the things that Tina and Jane mentioned, like who is making the laws? And not just who's making them, but who's making them and then who's impacted by them, right? So if you're making laws, but you aren't the community or the person who is being impacted by them, then there is a lot that you're missing in your blinders, being in that position and having that position of power and privilege, which is why it's so important that it's not about inviting these communities to the table. They get to build the table, period, right? That's how it should work. But with our system of white supremacy and racism, that's not how it's happening. Nina, I wanted to invite you to be a part of the conversation. I see you unmuted yourself too.
Yes. I was like, oh, so many things here. So, there's so many great points that are being brought out here. And in the space of kind of colonialism, and I believe Jane had actually mentioned it earlier, we really do see so much of this, it's just a continual impact, in our communities. And typically whenever we talk about what's happening with fashion, we're looking at it, largely in the global context, but only because we've really pushed a lot of our work outside of the States. And so things that people were doing, my grandmother used to work in a hosiery mill, those things closed and they were pushed out, into other communities where they could get the work for cheaper or something along these lines. However, I think that a lot of the decisions that are being made from, not just in the States, but overseas about what's allowed and what's not allowed are really these kind of economic juggles of what they feel like they need more in their community. It may not be that they want to get rid of a particular resource for their community, but they need this additional income so much more that they're willing to sacrifice what happens in communities of color. in order to get it. And we've been seeing this across the board. In Ghana, I just recently spoke with a brand that specializes in upcycling and working in the largest secondhand market globally, Kantamanto and Accra. And they, have seen hundreds of thousands of tons of old clothing being dumped into their water supply, onto their beaches, things that come into the market to be sold that undercut all of the beautiful traditional product that's being made, things that are getting completely wiped out because the price of the secondhand goods are so cheap. And so it's not only affecting their environmental spaces, it's affecting their tradition, and it's cutting things out that people aren't even really considering. And governments are making these decisions, from an infrastructure component. They're making these decisions because of what economic opportunities there are for the country as a whole. So they're like, yeah, we can displace, we can move, we can, not because they want to, but because they feel like they have to in order to keep other economic opportunities available for import and export and creating other opportunities. Now you go over to East Africa, you go to Ethiopia or Eritrea or Somalia, their rules about what they allow to come into their countries are completely different. And they've paid a price for that. They've had to build a lot of their own economic work in terms of their industry on their own, because a lot of that import export hasn't been available because they are not willing to accept waste from the UK. They are not willing to accept waste from, hi Pumpkin, you can come. They're not willing to accept waste from the UK. They're not willing to accept waste from the US. And it's constantly littering and causing long-term issues. Just a couple of numbers here. 60% of what's happening in the fashion industry is going to landfill. 20% is what's going into incineration. So if you're thinking about these incineration, where things are getting burned, if you can imagine 4%, it's only 4% that's getting sent overseas, but that's equating to over 700,000 tons, 4%. How much more is contributing to the larger story of what the waste is, the millions and millions of tons, because of overconsumption and overcreation. These are, and really our psychology around how we consume goods in fast fashion. So, disproportionately affecting communities of color, but these communities are making a juggle between other resources too. It's not just whether or not they're willing to accept it, it's the trade-off, for other opportunities.
And so what you're talking about reminds me, Nina, and I don't remember who I heard say this, but it's the difference between making better choices and having better choices, right? When we start talking about these types of conversations, a lot of times we look at it as a moral issue for some reason, and saying like, I made better choices, therefore like you're bad because clearly you aren't making better choices. But there's a difference between having the privilege to make, having the privilege to have a better choice, as opposed to having to make a choice between two things that are equally bad, but that's what's the option for you. And so when we're having these conversations, I think it's important for us to remember that a lot of us didn't make better choices, we had better choices, right? Depending on what neighborhood you grew up in, what school you went to, where your house was located, what country you live in. So I'm so glad you brought that up. And clearly it keeps coming back also too, because as you're talking about data and numbers, right? We hear these little numbers, like it's only 4%, but when you really consider what does 4% mean, where is it going, who is it affecting, it's important who's telling the story around the data, and then how are we working to fix and solve for that. And then we don't even talk about like air quality, we talk about like land and soil pollution and water pollution, but what people are breathing, right? It's important for us to have those conversations too. Jane, I see you unmuted yourself. Do you want to add something to that?
I just wanted to say one more thing. We rarely talk about American residents or citizens in the context of our human rights. Like when we say human rights in the US, we frequently are talking about the Bill of Rights, but there are actually like human rights that are inalienable inside of all of us and that are guaranteed and protected under international law. And one of those rights is the right to information, the right to know. And there is actually a lot of information that our government, our local, state especially, but also federal governments intentionally keep from us. They lie to us, they obfuscate They tell people that they're doing something they're not doing, or they're not doing something they are absolutely doing. I'm hearing Nina say about like East African community, the countries of Kenya and Ethiopia who do have more restrictive import laws. And the United States government is right now trying to manipulate the laws against plastics and importation of waste in Kenya and the entire East African community through the power they hold in the free trade agreement. And the fact that that is happening in the background while we are having these global conversations about waste, and while Kenya is a leader in zero waste, in waste reduction, in bans on plastics on the African continent, and the United States government is at the behest of the chemical industry, leaning on them to make those laws more lax and then telling us they're not, right? So that's also a big problem, is that our government is doing things. Yes, they have to like make trade-offs and weigh, as Nina is saying, but also there are lots of decisions the government is making that we just don't know anything about, and that is intentional. And I think that that's also something we've got to overcome in this conversation.
So many different ways that this conversation can go. So I wanna move forward to like talking more specifically about food recovery and farming, right? So there's often this negative narrative related to how stories are told about disenfranchised communities participating in food recovery. And so can one of you speak to the nuance of the food recovery industry and how it perpetuates both racism and classism? Tina, you wanna start?
Oh goodness, how do you start? Well, let me tell you. So for me as a person, I feel like there's been a general disconnect of the land, right? There's been a disinvestment, not only in BIPOC communities, but also in farming, in agriculture. You see more of, especially here in Louisiana, you see more of our farm fields being turned into subdivisions, more than growing corn or wheat or, rice or any of the things that we need to eat. And now, especially like in BIPOC communities where we find ourselves in food deserts, where food deserts wasn't the hot topic, right? Like food insecurity was not what everybody was talking about. People were talking about it in small circles, but they weren't really talking about it like on the levels at which it needed to be talked about 10 years ago. Now I'm very excited that people are talking about it, people are caring about it. But what you see now is the people who have access to that information and to the data and to the people who can tell them, the policies that they can use to find the grant funding. Sometimes we lose, portions of our community to gentrification unintentionally by well-meaning white folks and people from outside of our communities that come in that want to feed us because we lack access to healthy food, healthy fresh vegetables. Our grocery stores, our cigar and potato and rice stores in our community that sell us hot plates every now and again. Those people don't have fresh produce in their stores. We don't have grocery stores. Like we lost 3 grocery stores in the last 10 years in our community. Why? We're hungry, we eat, there's a misconception across the community, and you can call it classism, you can call it racism, but that African-American communities are poor. We don't have any money, but I promise you that there's professional people across this community who have income, who would like to see the same things. And for me, everything really boils down to equity, and how we have access to the things that other communities don't. In Macomb Vise, us in particular, we saw the need. We saw that our community was in a food desert. As I said, we lost 3 grocery stores. We lost our first Piggly Wiggly, which was located within our cultural district. And then we lost an Albertsons that was actually we lost 4. So just thinking about it now. So we, we've lost so many grocery stores in our community that limits the access to our communities, which forces people in our community with limited access to transportation and other resources to either walk or get on the bus or ask a friend or a neighbor to get them to a grocery store to get some healthy produce. And most times they end up at a dollar store. We lost a bunch of grocery stores. We got a lot of Dollar Trees. We got a lot of Family Dollars. We got a lot of Dollar Generals that brings in a lot of processed foods. It brings in a lot of plastic foods, a lot of unhealthy foods. And most of those foods sit on the truck for about 12 hours before they actually make it into the freezer, right? Those things are not healthy for our communities. So the spark of urban farming, especially within the Lafayette community, I think has really helped with in the Macomb-Visay area, with us getting our agriculture and tourism established for Macomb-Visay, that welcomes in people from our community to come and learn how to do agriculture, how to, reconnect with the land. You don't have to grow with us. We will send you home with plenty to grow, right? We just want you to reconnect with the land and to grow. And you see that we are one, and we are one community, an African-American community in Lafayette Parish, but we are one of very few across our state that are activated in this way. Many of which you'll see, as I said earlier, white-led organizations that come into our communities to meaning well, honestly, meaning well, so that wants to teach our community, about produce. But what happens is they farm our land in our communities and then take the produce out of our communities sometimes, not always recycling it back in to the communities. It's often for profit and not for benefit of the community. And with our plan, what we do is we grow for the community. We make our produce available to the community free of charge, but we also sell it to those who come into our community who want to support, so that we can recycle that money back into what's needed and how the community wants to grow, and make sure that they have a voice in their opinions and what's happening in our community, but also have a voice from the community at the city's level as far as what's needed on a more local, larger scale for Lafayette Parish.
So a lot of the things that I'm hearing you say, Tina, too, is reminding me of like the conversation we were having about who makes policy and then who's impacted by policy. So when you're talking about grocery stores leaving your community and then dollar stores being replaced by that, like that is literally the business model of dollar stores and Dollar Generals and Family Dollars, is to go into low-income BIPOC communities and exploit them. Mm-hmm. That is their policy, and it's on their web, like you can read about it. And the fact that like this is allowed to continue and be prevalent in this country is alarming to me. And then when we're talking about like the narrative and the conversation around like food insecurity, the labeling of those communities as food insecure or as food deserts, like the privilege to be able to label entire communities with those names, I think too is something that we need to continue having a conversation around, like who is doing the labeling and who is impacted by those negative racist policies that led to that. Because again, it's not moral choices. It's not about making better choices, right? It's having access to choices. And so like, listen, I feel like I should be on the panel instead of being the moderator. Karen, I see you want me to. Did you have something to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, gosh, let's see, it took a little bit of diversion there, because one of the pieces I wanted to get into was also how from the food recovery industry, right, it's become an industry as well. It's actually like a major component of our food system, right, that how food gets diverted to food banks is part of the business model of agriculture. Mm-hmm. And then I was going to zoom out as well to sort of a larger perspective on, we in the US overall, right, plenty of food is produced and a lot is wasted, right? There's numbers about 40% of our food in the US, like it varies globally, but in the US, like it's like on consumer facing sides, like it's actually about 60% of food wasted maybe, but 40% on consumer facing sides. But that's clearly there's disconnects. Mainly the point is there's disconnects throughout the food system, right? Because we know that the food system is inequitable. And there's been a lot of this emphasis on emergency food. We have this emergency food network, which was never built to be, I mean, it's a fundamental part of our food system, right? Food banks, food pantries, emergency food access. It's not really for emergencies. Maybe in small cases when it's, natural disasters, there's really truly emergency food distributions, but it's a fundamental part of our food system. And that's now just encoded. It was meant to be truly like a safety net to catch people from the most dire of circumstances, and yet now it's just a regular piece of the food system. So yeah, what does it say about our food system that that the food that's it's fine to give certain people the food that was going to be wasted, right? It sends a message, and it was related to this labeling of food deserts, and being able to, for me, it connects in that way of like, okay, well, the food that was going to be was too too ugly to go to the grocery store. And also, first off, I want to back up and say there's also variety within grocery stores, right? There's different classes of produce that get to different grocery stores,
Yes.
right? Like you do not find equal produce at all grocery stores, right? So first off, there's like a disconnect there, and second, like, okay, there's even a lower class of, of produce that can only go to food banks because it can't be sold. It's like, okay, well, and that's what we're going to say is okay to give to people experiencing food insecurity, let alone the other, like if it's coming from other places of food diversion, that's okay to give to people, that it's really like the waste. And I know we were talking about this, and as we were prepping for the panel, this whole idea of like garbage food for garbage people, right? Like we really have to grapple with that. Like, is that what we're saying and building into our system? I mean, yes, we have a food waste problem, and we also need to not discount that, yes, we have to maintain the imperative of emergency food access, right? That we need to get food to people, and that there's ways to use food diversion. But fundamentally, I just, I forget who was saying, like, there's going to be questions asked and things that we're not going to have neat answers to. And this is one of them, I feel like. On the one more piece too is, we have major retailers that are touting food diversion, right? Grocery stores. And there's complexity to this, right? It's not that we don't want to say, hey, don't have grocery stores working on better systems of inventory that are going to reduce food waste, or that are going to identify waste and get it, in a different way to a different channel. But also at the same time, it's their employees that are experiencing food insecurity, right? Because they're receiving insufficient wages, and good, high numbers of employees at major retailers are going to be on food stamps. In fact, food workers have the highest level of food insecurity in our nation. And we look at farm workers the exposure to toxic chemicals, and coupled with food insecurity, like for me, that's just mind boggling that like the people that are working on food, like handling our food, cannot purchase sufficient food for themselves and their families. I lose my words on it. It's infuriating. And yeah. So that was just for me, like sort of the backing up of that piece where I wanted to raise some points.
Yeah. So when you're talking about like garbage food for garbage people, something that comes to mind, like from an economic development standpoint, I hear a lot, like particularly when I worked in Lafayette, because to Tina's point, there are a lot of grocery stores closing in predominantly Black and low income, which they aren't always synonymous. I hate that they're linked as synonymous, but they are not always synonymous. But anyway, there are a lot of grocery stores closing in those neighborhoods. And so the government had put together a committee to look at how do we attract grocery stores. And so they were looking at not Whole Foods, right? Not a Trader Joe's, not a natural food market. And because I was the only Black person at the table, I said, guys, solving for everything else, when you're talking about how much money a family of 4 on average needs to spend to feed their family every month, it is the same no matter what your socioeconomic income is. And they have to feed their families. So to say that a grocery store has a policy where we won't locate it in an area that doesn't have an average income of $80,000 is insane, because families, no matter what side you live on, still spend the same amount of money on food every month. Regardless of if you're using a food stamp card or a debit card, it doesn't matter. You're gonna need to spend the same amount of money to feed your families. But if nobody is at the table from an economic development standpoint, having those types of conversations, and this is what we're talking about when we talk about data, right? Using data to tell the right stories. A Whole Foods market, they located in what is known as like a low-income food desert neighborhood in New Orleans, and it is thriving. And they pay higher wages, right? They start at $12 to $15 an hour, which is a more livable wage. So when you're talking about, from all aspects of it, from an economic development standpoint, we can attract these grocery stores if there are different people at the table telling the stories of the neighborhoods. And it needs to be the people who live there, because you need to be telling the right story around the data that's happening. And when we're talking about frontline workers, it is unconscionable that as a country, people do not have access to food, full stop. Everybody should have the right and deserves to have access to food, full stop. And it should not be that we have to have an entire food recovery industry for people to be able to eat and live. And so these are the types of conversations that I think it's important for us to have, that a lot of times we don't think about no matter where we fall on the privilege spectrum, because on this Zoom call, like it's a privilege to be able to access the technology to even be on this Zoom call. That's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, I'm gonna go off on it.
Well, and I think my last thing was related to Jane was saying like about the human rights. It's like, well, what if we took the approach of like, and the role of government, and there's many different sectors we're talking about, but the role of government, you know, which is complex right now, especially it's tricky in pandemic times. There's a whole piece of this conversation we've not talked about, because there's just like any one of these segments we could spin out into an hour. But like what if we consider one of the roles of government was to create the conditions for people to access like good, nutritious, affordable food, and do so in a way with dignity. Like what if we had a right to food, and we do, I mean, we morally, it's a moral imperative, we do, but it's like, what if we took the approach of like, that was the role of policy, was to create those conditions.
Yeah, to set the standard, to say that, you know, this is what we expect as a country and as a society as far as how we recover food. But then also when you have companies that are developing new policies on how not to waste food, mainly how not to waste their money, mainly. We also need to make sure that they're building their systems on a system that actually works and functions for our community. If we still lack access to our community, or we get the ugly food, you know, what does that matter? People will turn away an ugly carrot. I promise you, they will turn away an ugly carrot, even if it's good for you. They will turn it away because they feel like they are given something that is less than, and not given what other people had access to. You call it a pride, you can call it whatever it is, but it affects the system needs to be changed in order for everyone to have true equitable access. Like I don't mind buying ugly things because they're usually cheaper, right? So, but people still should have access to beautiful things within their community, and that includes our produce and in the way we recover our food as well. There's no need for us to be throwing away so much food when there's so many people in our community that are hungry. There are so many people that work on their staffs that are going unfed, that are robbing Peter to pay Paul. I mean, you find it across all industries, and not just in the food industry, but even in healthcare. You have people within the healthcare industry who they can't afford a box of Band-Aids, but they just slap a bunch of Band-Aids on you for whatever reason, you know. So it's a large inequity across the board, but definitely within our food system.
And I just want to bring it,
no, go ahead, Jane.
Okay. There actually is a right to food protected in dozens of national constitutions, protected in at least one international treaty that has, 100 and something signatories. The United States has no right to food, either in what it has signed or obviously not in our constitution, because we don't have rights to those sorts of, things you need to live. I think that it's important that we, in this conversation, also be talking about when there are grocery stores, when there is access to fresh produce. A lot of times in grocery stores that are, well, I don't really know how the right way to say this, but Whole Foods prides themselves on their naked vegetables. They are unpackaged, they are on the shelf, they are leafy and green and delicious, and they have the little sprayer things that spray on them periodically so they stay fresh. But when you go to grocery stores that are frequently built in or serving neighborhoods of color, and particularly poor neighborhoods of color, particularly Black and Hispanic, what you find is grocery stores where most of the vegetables, if there is fresh fruit and vegetables, are wrapped in plastic. And we have been taught through advertising for 50 years that plastic keeps us safe, that it is healthy, that it is clean. Y'all, none of that is true. Plastic is extremely toxic. And it's not extremely toxic like if I eat this banana and it's wrapped in plastic, I'm going to die tomorrow. It's actually toxic in the way that it accumulates in your body over time. It is found to be persistent and disruptive to your body's natural systems, like the ones that regulate sleep and behavior and weight, all of which are disrupted systems in the human body that we now consider epidemics, although health words like that are a little bit difficult to talk about these days in the context of COVID. But these are massive epidemics that we have been facing as a community, which we also know, a lot of us, things like obesity, diabetes, these are also health epidemics that a larger burden is carried by the Black and Hispanic populations and Indigenous in the United States of these conditions. And they are all correlative with being exposed over and over and over again to plastics, and specifically plastic packaging. And also, you know, half the clothes I'm wearing right now are made of polyester, which is plastic. And so I'm breathing it in, and we're exposed to it all the time. And I think it's important that we also undo some of these myths, right? A lot of the reason why our food is wrapped in plastic is this idea that it somehow is making it more shelf stable, that it'll last longer on the shelf. And I think this goes back to Karen's point about systems, that the way grocery stores order food, the way they place them on the shelves, has a huge impact on how long that food stays fresh, much more so than what it may or may not be wrapped in. And if that wrapper is toxic, why are we choosing a toxic wrapper over like the water spray systems that keep everything fresh? And this is the thing that I struggle with understanding. Like, how are we having? It's not that I struggle with understanding. I struggle that so many of our decision makers are actually not incorporating this. And hearing, Skyra, you talk about your presence on that panel in Lafayette, and also Tina, your conversation about like how grocery stores are being built out in the neighborhood, and how you're having this, or not being built out, but how you're having this conversation about trying to have them built out. There is this underlying idea of like, when you walk into a Save-A-Lot, for instance, there's so much plastic packaging. That also makes me feel less than the like beautiful wall of green that is at Whole Foods. Like, why doesn't every grocery store have a beautiful wall of green that everyone has access to and just really makes you want to eat spinach? Like, I really just wish all grocery stores were designed in this way. And instead we're having this like compromise. Before we ever get off the ground, we're compromising about the quality of our grocery stores. And we deserve so much better than that. And I'm saying we, because I'm throwing in this liberated space, but obviously knowing that the Black communities in New Orleans and in my wider region have less access to beautiful walls of green. And that's, frankly, and I apologize in advance, bullshit. And I'll stop talking now.
Well, if you don't mind me jumping in, honestly, Jane, thank you so much for that. Seriously, it's another opportunity or another time when we're making decisions between two poor choices. My background is actually in public health before I went into fashion, and, you know, social determinants of health and comorbidities it is a constant conversation. It's why, you know, I saw Margot and Gigi's comments regarding COVID in the chat here. You know, COVID has been exacerbated in our communities because of these predetermining factors. However, when we get back to the environmental racism conversation, we're still making decisions between two poor choices, right? Do I use the water that's been contaminated to spray my vegetables to make them look beautiful in my community, or do I wrap them in plastic? Neither one of those are satisfactory, and both of them require infrastructure change. So, like, you know, in terms of policies that are preventing water supplies from being contaminated, to be able to make sure that you can even support that kind of display, you know, in a community that so desperately needs it. And then to be able to offer it at a price point that's appropriate. I mean, Skyra's right. Look, regardless of whether you make a lot or little, feeding someone costs the same, you know, and so that's actually a guaranteed money maker more than, you know, some of these other things. And truthfully, a lot of the bodegas and a lot of the corner stores are marked up and are much more expensive to eat from still, with poor food quality, than some of the places where you could actually get, you know, decent, you know, vegetables. And so, you know, you really kind of cut people off, you know, on so many levels, from the ability to make good choices for their families when they would like to be able to think environmentally when they would like to, but they haven't been given an opportunity to make better choices. Back to the polyester comment. Yes, that is I can't wait to jump into that. I think that's actually, I don't want to get too far ahead.
Can you hold it all so I can?
I will hold it.
Okay. So I just want to make one more comment because we need to move on to the next question. But when we're talking about comorbidities, like, I know Margot put something in the comments. I mean, this panel isn't specific to COVID, but the narrative, the negative narrative that has been perpetuated since COVID started is that if you are Black or brown in this community, then you are more likely to die from COVID. Y'all, that is false. I am not in public health. Here's why that is false. because of the impacts of environmental racism and racist policies, these communities live in areas where they don't have access to healthcare, where they don't have access to fresh and healthy foods, where they are living in environments where the air quality and the water quality and the land quality is toxic, it's cancerous. And so it is not because they are Black or brown or indigenous, it is because as a country, we have put them in a situation where they are more likely to have comorbidities because of the racist policies that we have intentionally enacted as a country. It is not because they are Black. I am not more likely to die from COVID because I was born as a Black woman, right? I'm more likely to die from COVID because I might live in a community that doesn't have access to a hospital or a clinic or a grocery store or clean air and clean water. So when we're talking about narratives, it is important that we're understanding who is telling these stories and then who is impacted by the stories that are being told. Okay, we gotta move on. I'm sorry, I just need to make that point. So historically the concept of, so we're gonna move a little bit into the fashion side. So historically the concept of reuse and upcycling in the thrift industry were pioneered by indigenous peoples, right? And yet more often than not, it is led and marketed by privileged, particularly privileged white and white presenting people. So Nina, can you speak to the relationship between current and historical trends in fashion in terms of both reuse and recycling, or thrift and upcycling, and how we can change the visual and verbal narrative to center around indigenous peoples and cultures?
Absolutely. So, I think that the conversation regarding how to change the narrative is a big one. It's a lot that goes into shifting the narrative. We can talk about things in certain circles. However, doing that in a way that feels authentic, kind of in this modern economy, with associations that are different now with some of these activities of mending and upcycling and, repairing. I think it's kind of begging a larger, it's begging a larger, discussion. However, I will say that whenever these things had originated, whether it was, Native populations, African, populations, African-American populations, I don't know about you, but my grandmother made all of my mom's and her sister's clothes. They were handmade. They were expertly made. She took her time. She made beautiful pieces for my mom and her sisters, and some for her husband as well. And, these things were made with care. They were made with a high level of quality. And so when you go to sit down to mend a garment that has been made well, you can actually do that for some time. You can pass those pieces down, similar to some of the indigenous populations that would, a lot of the heritage and history is passed down through coats, and the pride that was felt from wearing something that was given from my great-grandfather or from his father or from my grandmother, or something that had some historical significance. There was pride behind the clothing and not just a personal individualistic expression of who I am right now. And so again, this is back to the psychology, consumer behavior. Why do we wear what we wear? And how do we create that pride again? And I think a lot of it has to do with creating some level of individual ownership over the things that we create, as opposed to subscribing to mass inventory, mass, I just want to fit in assimilative ideals about how people have talked about fashion in the past. And so upcycling something of value, is a completely different conversation than upcycling fast fashion. So I want to go back to that comment I made earlier about Kantamanto Market in Accra, Ghana. And, so that market employs a lot of tailors, a lot of artisans to do exactly this. They're upcycling all of this Western clothing that's being dumped into their communities, adapting it, making it the right sizes, alterations. However, whenever they get a hold of this fast fashion, a lot of it's just fit to be burned, because you can't alter things that have been made poorly, not many times. And so a lot of it isn't even fit to be handled in that way. So when you're talking upcycling, you really have to start from a place of value before you can even consider doing it in a meaningful way that will last beyond a couple of hemmings, And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity on this. There's a lot of it's so funny. I was reading there's a girl I follow on Instagram, Sustainable Fashion Forum, and she's like, there's this new, she was talking to her grandmother. She's like, there's this new thing called mending. And the grandmother like rolled her eyes. Like, are you give me a break? Like, we've been mending our whole lives. So, so this idea of being this newfangled, zero waste thing of mending is not so, it's not so new. So I thought that was hilarious, but it's so, I think it's apropos for the way that we have changed. We've erased the original reason for it existing, and we've reinterpreted into a context where we've forgotten why it was there in the first place. And so I think when we start with a place of value, we have a reason to keep it, and we have a reason to invest in the time to keep it longer, and to support not putting more wasteful things in the community. I support emerging designers who are trying to create their collections. And what we tell them is, you need to find something that your customer loves and that will come back to you for more things that they will love, and invest in, and to come up with circular, ways to bring new life to a product that they've created. And so a lot of our efforts are to build in sustainability from the beginning, really finding ways to bring more sustainable clothing at an appropriate price point so that more people can participate. Typically that's been very expensive for people to say, oh, I'm wearing a sustainable label. It's typically over $100 or more per piece. That's not a way to change the populace. That's not a way to change consumer behavior. If to participate, you have to be, in one of these demographics that has a disposable income over a certain number. So, it's a lot there, Scary. I could probably spend more time on this all day. I think Karen is like, I think this could be several 1-hour talks.
Maybe we could do a series.
We could do a series on this for sure, but I'll stop there. But yeah, upcycling with value, I think has a greater possibility, and emerging brands leveraging technology to bring a more cost-effective product to market that people will love, I think is a great place for us to start.
So I know we're kind of bumping up against time. It's just such a really invigorating conversation. I want to make one comment, and then there are some questions from the audience that I want to bring to the panelists. But one of the things that I was reading a few years ago was there was an article about like the different perceptions between poor and white people who do the same. Poor and white people, that's not what I meant. Those who are poor and those who are wealthy, like speaking two languages, right? If you're poor, it's looked on as a negative, and if you're rich, it's looked on as a positive. Or passing down clothing. That's another one. And like not having to work is also like, you have to think about like the dichotomies of those two things and how, we're thinking about how we're naming these things. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that in as a point of reference. So one of the questions we have is, how do you suggest planning and development committees in cities that are looking for economically attractive development address the spatial inequity that is perpetuated by bringing outside investors with a lot of capital that want to purchase land in lower income areas and create large subdivision and retail areas? Tina, I'm gonna kick that one to you.
Oh my goodness. Can you read the question again?
So it's basically saying like, if you want to redevelop in lower income neighborhoods and there's an investor, right? How do you address with those communities the spatial inequity that is perpetuated by outside investors coming in and purchasing land in lower income areas?
Well, I think what happens in most cases that there's no conversation like with the people that actually live in the community, right? When developers come in, they find this perfect piece of property that is perfect for, whatever niche thing that they're doing at the time. And they start having the conversations with the people of the city who often don't have conversations or don't have connections with the people who are actually living on that street where that business or that development will be happening. So I think one thing would be definitely to start a conversation. I'm working currently with the community in Louisiana that is has an outside developer who has actually purchased property within their community. But before they came in and started to, you know, just start changing things and doing what they think needed to be done, they wanted to make sure that they had a conversation with their neighbors to make sure that what they wanted was right in line with what the community actually wanted, and that they were being responsible neighbors, having not lived in the community and not being from the community. They wanted to, you know, be a part of the true change. And I think when you engage the community in that way, you'll find that there's needs that you thought were needs that aren't, things that you think are needs for the community really aren't the needs of the community, and what they really need might be something else that can really take them to the next level. You know, it's the thing of, you know, if somebody's saying that, you know, oh, you know, there's all these people that's always in this house, oh my goodness, somebody keep kicking over my trash, I don't know what's going on. But you thinking it's the people that's kicking out, that's keep visiting the house, that's knocking over the trash, but really, you know, it's a stray dog or something that we need to really attack. You know, we're not really having the conversation. So I just want to encourage anybody that's interested in doing any type of development to be mindful that people in our community know what gentrification is, okay? They are aware. They have seen videos and documentaries on it. They are aware what gentrification is. And if you don't want to fall into that kind of colonizing gentrification class, I suggest that you start with conversation and start to get to know the people in the community, what their needs, wants, and desires are. And if they don't have any needs, wants, and desires, then that's a great opportunity for you to engage in a more deeper dive of conversation to figure out what those are and if there are any alignments, and whether you should move forward with the project.
Thanks, Tina. Another thing that I think for that question is if we think of a recent policy that was created by the federal government, opportunity zones, right? It's capital gains investment into low income areas. Who has capital gains investment? Wealthy white people, right? Typically, that's who has capital gains investment to invest millions of dollars into low income neighborhoods. So it brings us back to the point of like, who has the power? And it's typically those who own the land. If you own the land, you can decide, regardless of how it's zoned, what gets put on it. If you don't own it, you have less. So do BIPOC communities have ownership of their land? Because that's where you get your power from. And so if you don't have ownership, there's a whole lot going on there, but I think we should develop more mechanisms to allow communities to have more ownership within the land in their own communities. Another question that came up was, do you know of any cities that interweave environmental justice issues into their development policies and requirements?
So I was just starting to type an answer to that because I haven't, first of all, I don't think anybody's doing this great. Let's not lie to ourselves. Like, I think that there has been some analysis of where this has been started to do and how to think about criteria of it. Nobody's done it well, because if any city had done it extremely well, like, we'd be having a much larger conversation about it. But I'm about to put in the chat a report that came out last year from the Tishman Environment and Design Center. And Jordan, I don't know if you can put this on feed loop. And that actually highlights some cities that actually does start to list some criteria around, like, what does that even mean to be thinking about environmental justice in the context of development, and how much of it is about conversation with community, and how much of it is also about emissions, how much of it is thinking about gentrification, how much of it is all the different policy areas where you could be thinking about this placement. I have not read every word, and therefore this retweet is not an endorsement, but just as an informational area on this report. And I did just want to say one thing, about this conversation, which I think is also links both of the questions that were just asked about development from the outside, but also cities that are thinking about this well. No Waste Louisiana, the organization that I helped found, sort of prides ourselves on our mission of zero waste organizing within a context of justice. And so one of the programs that we have thought about designing is actually like working on a zero waste plan for the city of New Orleans. And as Tina was talking about, going neighborhood by neighborhood and doing some dreaming and thinking and planning. And there's a lot of ground that we have to lay before we do that, because there is so much capacity to do that really badly, and to do it in a way where we have these conversations where people think we are making promises to them, and then we don't fulfill on them. And the last thing I want to do is to go to every neighborhood in the city and facilitate this like amazing, dreaming, lovely conversation that never comes to fruition. And not only do people feel like they're extracted, their opinions were extracted by a white person again, but then nothing actually is fixed and changes. And I think that even the way that we are planning out and thinking of solutions needs to be done in a way that is equitable and just, and that even if we have these ideas, we don't deploy them until they make sense, until there's buy-in, until there's funding, until there's real political will to actually, or at least a plan for building power to actually do something about the plans. And I think that that's important as we think about how we envision something that is not extractive development and something that is not, I'll speak on behalf of the communities I'm from, not disaster capitalism, that is not this idea of, oh, something terrible has happened. And so now, you know, the rich white people with capital gains money come in and buy land and develop things that, like, maybe they're built on tourism and maybe they have this great idea to like reinvigorate the region with tourism, but actually all they're doing is designing a city where hundreds of thousands of people live around the people who are here for 48 hours at a time. And yes, I am talking about New Orleans. And I think that it's important that we also like think about what is the democratic decision making, right? Okay, it's all well and good for us to have a conversation with a community where voices were heard. But like, what does it mean for voices to be heard? And what is hearing a voice versus I have democratic power and control over the way development decisions are made? That's a whole other thing that we're really not talking about, except in like, again, dreaming, organizing conversations that I'm having. And I just, God, if we could design city government decision-making that is based around real democratic power, like how powerful would it be for us as a community to be like, yeah, it's okay for you to build a coffee shop there. Yeah, it's okay for you to build, no, it's not okay for you to build an incinerator there. Nope, 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 nope. And we should all like be able to weigh in and decide. And right now we don't do that. And yeah, so just leaving with that thought.
So I know we're bumping up against time. Thank you, Jane, for sharing. So I want to do a little lightning round where all of our panelists close out and suggest one way or one thing we, the audience, can do to make substantial shifts in the future of reuse and recycling towards anti-racism and equity. So I'm going to start with Tina. You're muted.
I know, lightning.
There you go.
You told me lightning. All right.
Lightning.
One thing, I think the power of conversation and building relationships is incredible. I think that if we want to really start shifting the tides, we need to start having conversations about really what got us to this point and how do we can actually make some actionable steps really to get us out of this slump, like get us to the next step. The last thing we want is, like Jane said, is to talk to a bunch of people and have a shelf on the plan, on a plan on a shelf, on someone's shelf that no one looks at, no one talks to, and then someone's gonna come 5 years down the line and say, I had this bright idea, but the idea happened 5 years ago and no one took the steps to actually put them in place. So just lean on relationships, always come in, no agenda, and be ready to, educate the community.
Karen?
So I would say, I'm gonna give a plug, support support HBCUs, support minority serving institutions in their education goals and their roles that they've been doing for, decades and decades. Like HT's been doing it for 144 years, working at the intersection of education and social justice. But don't come with solutions that fit your check boxes. Engage and listen and find out what will serve and support the education of and that institution. And related to that is find a way to support your local food system, but without asking a BIPOC person to do any like emotional labor for you, any type of labor, like whether that be emotional or other thing. Like don't, do your research and find a way to support your local food system.
Nina? You're muted.
Thank you. I had a little person running around. So for starters, I want to kind of start where Karen left off with education. Austin Community College really makes fashion education, fashion technology education available to populations that typically wouldn't have opportunities to learn about these kinds of things for a very affordable price. I think that's part of the workforce skilling up so that people are able to do better and do more for their families. But I think back to the consumer question that, the consumer topic that we've been talking about before is that, as a consumer, ask for more from these brands. They will make what you want to buy, and you really are ultimately our boss in our industry of what it is that we make. If you insist on certain kinds of product you made or not being made, that's what we build into. And so we really want to push, not that it's all the consumer's fault, but that the consumers play a role in helping us shift the industry as the industry is making steps towards cleaning up the entire value chain.
Jane?
Plus to everything that the other panelists have said. I think two quick things is, as you, I'm going to say you, because that was sort of how the question was framed. As we and you are thinking about doing this, not you, Skyra, but you who is listening, doing this in addressing waste, addressing inequity in an anti-racist way, you got to be prepared to reset the table. Like, you got to be prepared to have your agenda be adjusted and edited and changed and reset based on what the collective wants beyond what you or your small subset might want. And the second piece of feedback is, especially with a lot of folks who are now thinking about how to do anti-racism, and specifically white folks, be prepared to get it wrong and create spaces of accountability, create spaces of feedback, of truly humble and vulnerable feedback and accountability, because every step's not going to be right. And one of the things that we have to do to undo all of this is to be comfortable with failure and to be comfortable with growth on the other side of that. And I think it's important that we be continuing to decenter ourselves by centering a collective and by taking leadership from Black and Indigenous and Latinx people of color across the United States, and particularly in the South.
Thank you, Jane. So I want to thank all of our panelists, Karen, Nina, Tina, and Jane. Thank you so much, Jordan, and the State of Texas Alliance on Recycling, for allowing us to come and give you this wonderful panel. We hope to continue this conversation moving forward. One lightning round thing that I would suggest everyone do is don't make assumptions about communities that are not your own, and small is all. Small is all, you guys. So start small, and I think that we can work towards a better, more equitable, united community moving forward. So thank you all so much for joining us. I know Jordan said we can stay a little while after if you all have additional questions, but we appreciate you joining this panel and being with us throughout the morning and the early afternoon.
Yeah, and I definitely want to just give my appreciation and thanks to Jane and Skyra, Tina, Nina, Karen. The insights were just priceless. The takeaways are action call items that I think that STAR and our accompanying organizations are going to be able to carry forward. It provides the wind in the sails for us to take action and to break down these barriers, address these really big subject matters that need to be discussed. It's been far too long, and I'm super glad that we had this conversation, and this won't be the end of it. We are holding educational series after Summit with multiple webinars, and I will be in touch with all of you, because I would love to set up a few more sessions talking about those other topics that we could have easily spent a good 4 or 5 hours today diving into, and we have to. And so this will not be the end of this conversation. This will continue. And thank you to everyone that stayed in. Over 100 people at one point. We're still at 86 people online right now. So I'm not going to stop this right now. We will be back at 3:30 for the Environmental Leadership Awards. If you guys want to hang out and enter stuff into the chat, the Zoom chat, we can do that with the speakers. If you guys have to go, that is totally understood. But I'll keep this on for about 5 more minutes. So we can, if you want to chat, we can chat. Other than that, you guys enjoy the long kind of extended lunch break. We'll see you back at 3:30. And again, thank you very, very much for this incredible panel.
Thanks, Jordan.
Yep. I think there was a good thing, Terry Pratchett, and I'm just gonna speak off of this since we're all said and done, but Terry Pratchett had a book of Captain Samuel Vine's, and in the Boots theory, of socioeconomic unfairness. And the story was about boots and how a really good pair of leather boots back in the day cost $50. But the affordable pair of boots, which were okay of some sort, and they gave them maybe a season of two of wear, were about $10. But they leaked like hell when the cardboard gave out. And this is a quip from his book, so I'm kind of reading out of this. They were the kind of boots that Vimes always bought and wore until the soles were so thin that he could tell where he was in the ink morph on a foggy night and the feel of the cobbles. So very descriptive of basically having nothing underneath his feet and feeling the cobbles on his feet because of the poor value of the shoe. But the thing that was the good boots, they lasted for years and years. And the man that could afford the $50 pair of boots had a pair that would be keeping his feet dry for over 10 years' time, while the poor man, spending $10 on a cheap pair of boots, would spend hundreds of dollars over that same amount of time and still would have wet feet. So I think the topic of that was no economist will ever come up with a better description of why being poor is so expensive. So that's just what I wanted to point out. And it goes back to the whole thing of we make cheap stuff, we can't even upgrade it, we can't do it. And yesterday, I think we had a conversation about that too. Most people in the 1920s bought 2 outfits and they lasted years. Flour sacks had dress designs on them. I actually just bought one off of an estate sale because someone had a flour sack with the dress design still on it when people would actually turn stuff that was intended for one use into something else. And flour packagers were putting floral designs because they knew people used them for dresses. You look now, I will say, to play it back, it is changing a little bit. Walmart is right now looking at the business model of when they sell a pair of clothes, it's basically a rental scheme. So it's a deposit. They're going to start sourcing quality apparel that when it is said and done, it goes back to the store. They take a responsibility. They take an ownership. It doesn't leak out into the environment. It is not just a one-off or a cast-off, and the ownership is withheld by the organization. So that's where the circular economy, everything that we're really pushing, it's the responsibility of the manufacturer to make it so they have pride, they have value, it has longevity for its intended use. Single use, like Tom Zaki said yesterday, it just needs to go away. We don't need to make something and design something just for its intended one-use thing. That is not the purpose of a plastic bottle that holds water to go and be made into a t-shirt that 85% of those textiles in 1 year will be thrown into a landfill. That's crap. So
That's right.
I'll get off my soapbox there. And if anyone else wants to talk.
Yes, Jordan. Tell them. That's right. That subscription model is saving a lot of people, and it's forcing you to make quality because now you have to see how many wears it actually lasts. Typically, when we sell product, we sell it to you. We have no idea if you have it with the tags on in your closet. We don't know if you wore it 2 times and tossed it or gifted it away. We have no idea what happened to that product. The moment you start subscribing, you know exactly what happened, how many times it happened, and if that product lasts 2 washes, 3 washes, 8 washes, 10 washes. And now because they can monetize every wear, now they're going to be, oh, well, let's make it a little nicer then, And so now all of a sudden the value is coming back to the clothes because there's a reason for that to happen in this new model, whatever it takes.
Right.
I'm really excited about the extended producer responsibility bill that's making its way through the federal government. I know it's not a priority right now, but I mean, so what we do as a country when we're talking about consumerism and marketing is we place the onus on the consumer to recycle things that manufacturers and producers are making. Like they are creating the problem and the onus is on the consumer to somehow fix it. That's crazy, right?
That's not even a century-old notion either. You know what I mean? That's only 50 years old, that whole process.
And it shouldn't be on the consumer or local governments to figure out like, how do we help our consumers recycle better or recycle right or be more circular? The onus should be on the manufacturer and the producer of the product that's leading to our oceans being oversaturated with plastic, our soil being consumed with toxic fumes, our air quality being reduced. And so how do we start to grapple with things like that? So I'm really excited about the extended producer responsibility bill.
Yeah, and I mean, not to take the wind out of the sail on that one, it is pretty much dead on arrival that we feel the Udall-Lowenthal break free of plastics bill doesn't have much momentum at the federal level. It is European policy brought to America, and that is like bringing
sorry, Jordan.
California.
As someone who's actually been working on that bill for months now, can I we're gonna not bring that negativity into this conversation. No, I'm serious, because I think I just want to reset us. There are dozens of organizations with dozens of staff members who have been supporting Udall and Lowenthal, who have been working our own representatives. There is a lot of, we're up against a lot in that bill. And I think it's also important that we actually be centering the fact that what I'm seeing is a ton of support from communities who are labeled by the federal government as environmental justice communities, whatever the hell that means. I mean, I know what it means, but I think it's a weird label. And we are seeing communities that are actually fighting tooth and nail for this bill to get passed. We are seeing a lot of groups who are working really hard on it. And I think that while it has no success potential this year, we are going to be entering into a new political phase, for better or for worse, and hopefully for better, in the beginning of the year. And I think it's important that we actually be saying nothing but positive things about the legislation that will actually save people's lives. So respectfully, Jordan, I am actually just going to push back and say, I think it's important that we tout the fact that this bill includes moratorium on new plastic production. It includes real incentives for reuse and refill, which is what we talked about here. It specifically makes reference to another piece of legislation, the environmental justice legislation, that is also moving through the Congress right now. And part of why we are up against such an uphill battle is because we don't have enough public support. So with 61 people on the call and people watching this recording, this is a good bill, and it will do great things to save people's lives. And I hope that you guys would support it. And thank you for letting me interrupt you, Jordan.
No, and I was gonna, so the second part of my statement was that, it came over, it's a European model that's come over to America. And it's like taking a California policy and providing it to Texas. It's unpalatable at this time. Doesn't mean it won't happen. And what I really like about it is the call for action. And so I sit on the National Stewardship Action Council. We work directly with Senator Lowenthal and Udall, and we have been hands-on with the creation of this bill, the supporting of this bill, the pushing through of this. So in no way was I trying to detract or deter from the importance, the greatness of it. It's just, it's in a moment of time that we're not, in my opinion, we're not going to see it at the federal level yet. And another point of the constitutional right, access to food and all that, and America doesn't have it. We're also one of the most economically developed countries that does not have an overall national policy for material management either. So there's a lot of missing policy here that can help it. The thing that really excites me is that the call for the national level action has been made to push the Break Free from Plastics Act locally. So yes, to your point, Jane, we are seeing local communities pick up that action, just like Alameda County did and Washington did with the pharmaceuticals and the sharps. That started spreading like wildfire. A bunch of communities started doing it, and now it is a state bill in California. So I don't think it's gone. I don't think it's inappropriate to talk about. It is fully viable. It's just going to take a lot of action and a lot of time, because we're breaking down the norms, we're breaking down the barriers, we're breaking down everything that people are comfortable with, and we're saying, this is wrong. Basically, in a nutshell, you can't just say you're going to break free from plastic and then now go open up a brand new cracking plant in Pennsylvania. Doesn't work, right? So I understand the moratorium, and I am in totally agreement. Again, I'm helping create this bill just right along with you. So what I was happy about was that the local level action STAR will also be helping to push those kind of initiatives here until we actually get a government that is focused and front and center on policy that will make effective change, not only to materials, but to poverty, to inequality, to access, to everything, basically. America has got to wake up and change.
All right, then. Should have had you on the panel too, Jordan.
I know that was a lot, but well, it's a huge thing. It is. That's the only way we're really going to do things. That's how it works in Europe and every other country. Policy is a directive, and it happens from the top down. If people have something to follow, if states have something to follow, they will do it. But right now it's patchwork. It's someone does this, it's favorable, they cherry pick low-hanging fruit, or someone aims for the sky and tries to do the 10,000 mile high goals, and no one can do what everyone else is doing because no one even knows exactly what we're all doing. And so that's the biggest part of this problem is you need help. And in my opinion, that's through legislative policy, whether that be punitive, whether that be rewarding, I don't know, carrot or stick, maybe it's a combination, but there's change coming. And not to continue this conversation, Nestle Waters North America, they just joined us. So 2 weeks ago, they just joined our organization because they own Ozarka Water here in Texas. They own the full thing. And so they're using, they want to be fully circular with their packaging and all that. So that's, you know, I see change coming in little ways because the fingers are pointing, policies are changing, and the attitudes are dramatically shifting towards producer responsibility. So yeah.
Do we have any other questions from those still on the call? So glad you all joined us and you're still here. So clearly we did somewhat of a good job.
Yeah, we're nearing almost 2 hours now. It's great. But Debbie, Heather, Gigi, putting people on the spot. Anyone else? Jane or Karen, anyone else have any thoughts or anything?
Sorry, I'm multitasking because I have both computers going. I have the Zoom call on this monitor and the feed loop call on this monitor, and the people who are only using feed loop want those links that are on the Zoom call, and I can't figure out how to do it. But somebody out there probably has the ability to do that. My computers don't talk to each other, but everybody is super excited, and a lot of people are wanting to jump on board and do some actionable items in their own communities to help facilitate and perpetuate the change that's needed in Texas and beyond.
A document real quick and copy these links, and then I will paste them in the feed loop chat as soon as I get done with this.
I don't know if the person is still here who was asking about grocers. And one of the things that I wanted, just in case they are still listening and here, was labeling on food is one of the major ways to reduce food waste, sort of on that consumer facing side. Like having a federal standard for that, it's a patchwork, it's by state, it varies. Also, they're not anything to do, labels on food have nothing to do with safety. It's about sales and quality. So it's extremely confusing, and it's not actually to the benefit of the consumer, and definitely not towards anything about reducing waste. I mean, I know personally from my family, like my dad will go through the fridge and anything that's just past the date will throw out, when that's completely irrelevant to the actual safety of the food, and even, you know, relates a little bit potentially to the quality, but really it's, yeah, I want to say, so that's one of the ways that, like, for instance, like the UK reduced food waste was standardizing labels and then pairing that with public education campaigns about what the labels really mean. And so that's been shown really effective as one of the ways to reduce food waste. Just wanted to mention that because I saw that was a question in the chat.
So when you're talking about labeling, Carrie, are you talking about like expired by dates, or are you talking like generally, like, you know, we can go into the whole like organics labeling?
No, I'm talking about those like best by, used by, sell by, like best of used before, like those dates. Yeah. There's a whole other conversation about like, yeah, labeling for quality standards, which is a great conversation. Love that, but different, related, probably tangential to waste. Yeah, I'm talking about like labeling for food. There's only very specific where it's like sell by because it actually relates to safety. Most of them are, yeah, only related to sort of a quality, perceived quality of the item related to how it was intended, right? And there's a whole like as Jane was mentioning, there's a whole marketing aspect into that. And maybe the best cases is that it's for stores to do inventory control, but it's really nothing to do with safety, and is a cause of a lot of waste.
Yeah, NDRC is, I know they're working on trying to make that less obscure as far as the what is NDRC anyway. And they have some commercials and stuff that they're trying to get better about the best by, used by, you know, no use by dates. You're right though, it's a huge point of confusion, and it's a huge product. It results in the massive amount of food being lost because people are just like, they don't know, like the egg cartons. I mean, egg cartons are inappropriately labeled because we already know from data that the date on there, it can extend up to like 6 weeks sometimes past that date that's printed on there, and the eggs are still fine. But people look at that date and they toss a dozen eggs right in their trash because it says October 5th or whatever, and that's it. I see the one on standardized labeling for recycling. California just passed that legislation last session, eliminating the RIC, the resin identification code. It's not, the chasing triangles have nothing to do with recycling. All that does is points that the manufacturer used a certain type of plastic to make their product. It has nothing to do about recyclability. And so California actually has mandated that companies do not put the chasing triangles on their plastic materials. And in fact, it'll be a solid triangle to completely separate itself from being recyclable versus showing what resin was actually used in the production of that material.
That's a huge public education campaign that I think, I mean, it's not just literally the advertisements on TV, but it's the packaging literature around whether it's a sell by date or the way that the resin code is done. You know, I give these presentations on plastics all the time, and I always ask people, like, what do you think what do the 3 arrows mean? And they're like, they mean recycling, it's recyclable. I'm like, it does not at all mean that. Because there's also like chasing arrows around plastic number 3, which is PVC, and plastic number 6, which is polystyrene, and neither of those is recyclable. And I think undoing exactly that, I think the California law is great, and it's gonna take a like state by state or potentially even country by country, unless we get a new treaty on plastics, which is actually what the bulk of my work is about. And if you want to talk about that, we should do that. But I think it's actually important that we have these standardized metrics and labeling systems so that people, again, going back to our conversation earlier about a right to know, people know what they're exposing themselves to. They know what is and is not recyclable, and they're not spending time like I do. I have 4 different waste bins in my house. And like, if we're spending time separating it out, we need to know that what we're actually doing is gonna mean something and is going to keep people safe and healthy. And it doesn't mean that. And I think it's important that we actually not just educate people on that, but also turn that education into, okay, so then what's the other option? What's the next best thing?
Totally agree.
Clearly, we could do this all day.
Yeah, I was going to say we're wrapping up coming up on 2 hours. I appreciate you guys giving nearly 30 more minutes of your day. So I guess we'll go ahead and call this session amazing and super good. And again, I'm not going to say it's done, because we're not done talking about this. It's just, we're going to end this session. And so go enjoy some a bite to eat. Please network with people. I'm sure people will have some questions. If you need access to any of these sessions going on the rest of the day or the next couple of days, just let me know, and I can get you guys some access to that. But again, thank you very much for the nearly 60 people that hung out, and now 50 people. But we had a lot of people just still hang out for an additional half hour of conversation. Jane, Karen, Nina, Skyra, Tina, again, super appreciative. The virtual round of applause is roaring, and great. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. We will all talk soon, and thank you very much again.
Thanks, Jordan.
Awesome.